Africa sits atop a third of the world's mineral wealth, yet 33 of the 48 poorest countries on Earth are African. For decades, the World Bank and the IMF lent billions, but demanded repayment in dollars, forcing nations to sell raw resources, collapse their own industries, and lock themselves into permanent debt. Between 1980 and 2000, African countries paid 4 times more in interest than they received in aid, but somehow still owed even more. This is the story of how the eternal debt machine was built, not by accident, but by design. Colonial rule in Africa left behind a landscape shaped for extraction, not for building nations. Railways and roads carved through the interior, but almost every track and path led to a port. The logic was simple. Move copper from Katanga, cocoa from Ghana, gold from the Rand, and oil from Nigeria out to ships bound for Europe. These lines bypassed villages and towns, connecting mines and plantations directly to the sea, while the spaces between remained isolated and underdeveloped. National borders, drawn in distant capitals, sliced through ethnic groups and trade routes, creating dozens of new states with little internal cohesion and fragmented markets. At independence in the 1960s, African leaders inherited countries where the economy was built to export raw materials and import finished goods. There were few factories, almost no integrated transport networks linking regions, and little capacity to process or manufacture at home. Domestic markets were stunted, with infrastructure designed to funnel resources outward, not to connect people or stimulate local trade. Even basic goods like machinery, medicine, and vehicles had to be purchased from abroad, paid for in hard currency. The new governments faced an enormous gap. They needed schools, hospitals, power plants, and roads to unite their populations and create real economies. But with weak tax bases, shallow banking systems, and almost no foreign exchange reserves, they lacked the capital to build. The only way forward seemed to be external finance. In this moment of hope and urgency, the World Bank and the IMF stepped in, offering development loans to fund the work of nation building. What looked like a lifeline was, in reality, a new kind of dependency, one anchored in the very structures colonialism had left behind. Loan agreements from the World Bank and the IMF arrived with signatures and seals, but the real power sat in the fine print. Almost every contract required repayment in United States dollars, or sometimes special drawing rights, currencies African governments could not print or control. To pay back these loans, countries had to find dollars on the world market. For most, that meant ramping up exports of copper, cocoa, oil, coffee, whatever raw materials could fetch hard currency. The structure was rigid. Principal and interest payments were scheduled years in advance and denominated in United States dollars, regardless of what happened to local economies or currencies. Commodity prices on global markets are famously volatile. When copper prices crashed in the mid-1980s, Zambia's export earnings collapsed overnight, but the United States dollar repayments stayed the same. Ghana faced a similar squeeze when cocoa prices slumped, leaving the government scrambling for dollars just to keep up with the loan schedule. If the local currency lost value, a common outcome after independence, each dollar of debt became more expensive to repay at home. The cost of servicing the same loan could double or triple in local terms after a devaluation. The contracts also dictated how the money could be spent. Disbursements often went straight to foreign contractors or suppliers, bypassing African treasuries entirely. Imports of machinery, cement, or technical services were paid for in dollars, and local economies saw little benefit. The result was a mechanical dependency. To meet each round of payments, governments had to keep exporting raw materials, even as world prices swung wildly. When export revenues fell short, the only option was to borrow again, locking countries deeper into the cycle. The hard currency clause in every loan document turned commodity price swings and currency shocks into fiscal crises long before any policy reforms or structural adjustments were ever imposed. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank did not just lend money to African governments in crisis. They handed over a playbook. Every country that accepted a structural adjustment loan faced the same set of demands. First came deep cuts to public spending. Budgets for health, education, and food subsidies were slashed to free up cash for debt payments. Civil service wages were frozen, hiring was capped, and ministries were ordered to do more with less. Next, state-owned companies such as water utilities, electricity boards, telecoms, banks, and mines were put up for sale. These public assets, built with decades of national investment, were auctioned to private buyers, often foreign corporations, at prices set in a hurry. The proceeds went to pay creditors, not to rebuild local economies. Trade protections did not survive the adjustment. Tariffs and quotas that had shielded local farmers and manufacturers from cheap imports were dismantled. Borders opened to goods from Europe, the United States, and Asia, products grown or made with heavy subsidies back home. African producers found themselves competing with prices they could never match. Currency devaluation was another standard measure. Governments were told to let their currencies fall, making exports cheaper in dollar terms and imports much more expensive. The theory was that weaker currencies would boost exports and growth. In practice, the cost of everything from fuel to medicine soared overnight while the value of salaries and savings collapsed. Each of these reforms was a condition for receiving the next loan tranche. Miss a target and the money stopped. The logic was strict. Prioritize debt service, open markets, shrink the state, and let the private sector lead. The policies came from Washington and Geneva, but the consequences landed in classrooms, clinics, and markets across Africa. This was not a one-time fix. It was a template, imposed again and again, locking entire societies into a cycle of austerity and dependence. On the ground in Zambia, the numbers on loan agreements turned into empty wards and shuttered clinics. In the early 1980s, as copper prices collapsed and dollar debts mounted, the government signed on to IMF-backed austerity. The first orders came from the Ministry of Finance: cut spending, freeze wages, stop hiring. Within a few years, the health budget in real per-person terms had fallen to about half what it was a decade earlier. Hospitals that once ran on tight margins now ran out of everything: antibiotics, gauze, even basic painkillers. Rural clinics, already stretched thin, closed their doors or operated only in name. For many communities, the nearest working health post was now hours away by foot or by bus. Doctors and nurses faced impossible choices. With government wage freezes and staff ceilings, more than half of physician posts in public hospitals went unfilled by the late 1980s. In some districts, 3 out of 4 health centers reported vacancies. Equipment broke down and was never replaced. Vehicles sat idle for months waiting for spare parts the ministry could no longer afford. Even in Lusaka's University Teaching Hospital, the country's flagship facility, wards closed or merged as staff left for better pay abroad or in the private sector. Patients lined the corridors, waiting for care that never came. User fees, introduced under cost recovery policies, put healthcare further out of reach. For many families, a sick child meant a choice between buying medicine and buying food. Mothers arrived at clinics only to be turned away for lack of payment or told to bring their own supplies. The sickest often stayed home, hoping for recovery that seldom came. This collapse hit just as Zambia faced a new crisis: the explosion of HIV and AIDS. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, infection rates soared. Hospitals, already stripped of staff and supplies, found themselves overwhelmed. Beds filled with patients suffering from tuberculosis, malaria, and opportunistic infections that could have been treated with basic care. But the system was hollowed out. In some years, the government spent more servicing foreign debt than on the entire health sector. Health workers remember those years as a time of loss. They watched preventable deaths rise, not because the medicine was unknown, but because the budget lines had vanished. The money that could have kept clinics open and stocked with drugs instead went to creditors in New York, London, and Washington. Debt service came first. The public paid the price in lives. For Zambia, the promise of development loans was measured not in new hospitals, but in empty wards and silent clinics. Across Africa, small farmers once produced enough maize, millet, and cassava to feed their communities. That changed abruptly with the arrival of structural adjustment programs. Under pressure from the IMF and World Bank, Governments eliminated fertilizer and seed subsidies, dismantled marketing boards, and slashed tariffs that had shielded local harvests from cheap imports. The promise was greater abundance and lower prices. Instead, markets filled with foreign grain, especially U.S. corn, sold at prices African farmers could not match. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, U.S. maize arrived at 12 to 20% below its own cost of production, thanks to federal subsidies. European grain sometimes sold at discounts as steep as 40%. These were not true market prices. They were the result of policies in Washington and Brussels designed to protect their own farmers while exporting the surplus. Local growers, stripped of support, faced a new reality: compete with subsidized imports or abandon their fields. In Zambia, the government was forced to dismantle its National Agricultural Marketing Board and end guaranteed maize pricing. When tariffs fell, private traders imported maize and maize meal from South Africa at prices below what Zambian smallholders needed to survive. Local maize prices collapsed. Thousands of farmers left their land. Rural families who once sold surplus grain to pay for school or medicine now grew just enough to eat or left for the city. Zambia, once self-sufficient in good years, became a regular importer of staple foods. Each shipment had to be paid for in dollars, a currency that could only be earned by exporting more copper or taking on more debt. Ghana faced the same pattern. Tariffs on rice and maize were cut, and markets filled with cheap subsidized imports. Producer prices dropped. Smallholders shifted land out of food staples and into cocoa, or gave up commercial farming altogether. Across West Africa, US and EU grain, beef, and poultry arrived at prices below local costs. Local industries vanished. Regions that once exported food became dependent on foreign grain, even as their own fields went fallow. By the early 2000s, Africa's annual food import bill had soared to over $25 billion, up from $6 billion in the 1980s. According to the FAO, many countries that once exported food became net importers within a generation. The dollars needed to pay for these imports did not come from agriculture, but from new loans or accelerated mining and oil extraction. Every shipment of foreign grain pulled African economies deeper into the debt cycle, forcing governments to borrow again just to keep food on the table. For smallholder farmers, adjustment meant more than lower incomes. Fields were left untended. Rural communities emptied as young people left for cities. Food security, once a given, faded. The removal of subsidies and protections was not just economic policy, it was the dismantling of a rural safety net. As food imports grew, so did the need for hard currency and new loans. The agriculture trap was set. Each failed harvest, each price shock, each new import bill driving the continent further into dollar dependency and debt. Ghana's economic recovery program drew applause from Washington and London in the 1980s. The IMF and the World Bank held up Ghana as proof that structural adjustment could work. GDP growth returned, inflation fell, and cocoa exports climbed. But behind the headlines, the reforms hollowed out the country's social fabric and transferred control of key industries overseas. Privatization swept through the public sector. State-owned electricity and water utilities, once built with Ghanaian tax money, were sold to foreign companies. Gold mines in Obuasi and Tarkwa, symbols of national pride, passed into the hands of multinational corporations. Profits flowed out, while local communities faced pollution and job losses. The cost of adjustment landed hardest on ordinary families. As part of the IMF package, the government introduced school fees and cut education budgets. Within a few years, primary school enrollment dropped by 40%. For many children, especially in rural areas, the classroom became a luxury their parents could no longer afford. Teachers lost their jobs, and entire communities watched a generation fall behind. By 2000, Ghana's external debt had ballooned to $6 billion, more than the country owed when the rescue began. The so-called success story ended with less national ownership, deeper dependency, and a generation of students shut out of the future they had been promised. Between 1970 and 2002, African governments borrowed about $400 billion from foreign creditors. Over the same period, they paid back more than $550 billion in principal and interest. Yet by the end of it all, they still owed over $300 billion. The math defies common sense. More paid out than was ever borrowed, and the debt keeps growing. Jubilee Research called this the debt boomerang, a cycle where every payment only feeds a larger bill. In Tanzania, the government spent $9 repaying debt for every $1 it could put toward healthcare. The money that was supposed to fund schools, clinics, and roads instead left the continent as interest payments and profits. The winners of this arrangement are easy to trace. Western banks collected steady returns. Construction and engineering firms from creditor countries won contracts for dams, highways, and power stations, often paid directly from the loan proceeds. In Zaire, Mobutu Sese Seko borrowed billions, much of it siphoned into personal accounts in Switzerland and France, while the country inherited the obligation. Nigeria's Sani Abacha followed a similar script, stealing billions as the debt burden grew. The World Bank and IMF refused to recognize these debts as illegitimate, insisting that new democratic governments continue to pay. The system turned Africa's resources and public budgets into a revenue stream for creditors and elites, locking ordinary people into permanent repayment for money they never received. Today, Africa's external debt stands at over $500 billion, more than when the first so-called rescue began. As new lenders replace old ones, the cycle endures, shaping the continent's future from boardrooms continents away. The extraction isn't history, it is a mechanism still in motion. Until the machine stops, Africa's wealth will keep building fortunes everywhere but home.